We begin today the Gemara on Daf Hey Amud Aleph, 3 lines down from the top of the Amud, where it says, Rami Rish Lakish was lying. Okay, so this is a Gemara that will discuss the point of the first Mishnah, that when one has a machshava shaloi lishma regarding most karbanis, besides the chatas and the pesach, the carbon itself remains kosher. You can continue being makir of the carbon, but it's only for the owner that brought the carbon for his obligation that he's not yotzes chiyav and he has to bring another carbon. So now, Rami Reish Lakish al ma'oi bei medrasha. Reish Lakish was lying on his stomach in the bis medrash, which is an interesting thing that he's lying. There's mefarshim that give remazim about this, but he was in this position umakshi, and he asked a question about this halacha. Im kishayim, if this carbon, even after you had the kavanah shaloi lishma, it's still kosher, you can continue bringing it as a carbon. So if so, heim yeratzu, so then the owner should also get his atonement. It should work for his chiyuv that he has. And v'meim yeratzin, if the carbon does not bring its atonement for the person, so that means that the carbon is not effective anymore. So then lama boin. So then why is it being brought? That means that the carbon is not effective, so that basically should mean that the carbon is pasul. In the Mefarshim it says that the main question of Rish Lakish is the second part of what he's saying. He's asking like Memanav Shach, but the main question he's asking is, from the fact that you see that the carbon has no effect, what's a carbon? A carbon is just a physical thing that you bring a behem on the Mizbeach. The whole point of the carbon is the fact that it brings a kapara, or it's memala the chiyuv of the person. If it can't do that anymore, so that in effect means that the carbon should be considered invalid, so it's possible. How can we divide between these 2 points?
He wants to say that since this carbon doesn't have you can't use it, you can't bring it up on the mizbeach for
Correct.
anything.
That's right. It should be totally possible. Amalei Rabbi Lazar, it's the Girsi of Rabbi Yezer. Rabbi Lazar said that how could you ask such a question? I'll bring you an example where you see a carbon that can be brought as a carbon, even though there's no ritzui, it's not being used anymore with any effect for the owner. Because matzinu b'ba'al la'acham misa, we find a carbon that's brought after the owner passed away. Shehein kisheidin, so the carbon is kosher, but ve'ein meratzim, it's not bringing any kapara for the person that already passed away. So just like you find that it's not brought for a kapara for anyone, so, and the carbon is still kosher. The child, the son, brings it and it's still kosher, so it's not necessarily connected. There's an inyan of the carbon itself without it being a ritzi for the person. What's the case where we see this? A Mishnah that says, the Mishnah says, Ha'isha shehivia chatasa, a woman that brought her carbon chatas to be brought as a carbon. This is a woman that's a yeledes, she gives birth and she has a carbon that she has to bring. So she brought her chatas already. So that was brought, but there's another carbon she has to bring. Umeisa, now she passed away, yaviu yarishin oilasa, the carbon oila that she's supposed to bring, so her inheritors could bring her carbon oila. However, if she already brought her carbon oilasa, she brought, or umeisa, and then she passed away, but now it's the carbon chatos that she did not bring yet, lo yaviu yarishin chatasa. The chatos they cannot bring if she passed away. This is a unique halacha regarding chatos that's always brought. It's a halacha l'Moshe miSinai, that by chatos, when the owner dies, the carbon chatos has to be left to die. It cannot be brought as a carbon. That's a unique halacha l'Moshe miSinai by chatos. But by the oila, we see here that her children bring the carbon, even though she's not alive anymore. So there's no kapara for her anymore. So this concept is a concept that exists. So you can say the same thing here regarding the shaloi lishma, that it's not meratzah, but the carbon is still a carbon. Taisvis actually points out, just a second, Taisvis points out that it's not the example the Gemara is bringing here from this case is not exactly the same thing. Because by the carbon oila, she was makdish, the carbon oila, for a reason, and now there's a chiyuv to bring this carbon oila. True, it's not going to be a kapara anymore because she's not alive, but there's a chiyuv on this behemoth to be brought as an oila. So when you bring the carbon, you're bringing the carbon itself, and it's fulfilling a certain obligation, even if not a kapara. We're looking for a source to say that the obligation of the person in this carbon is not going to be fulfilled at all anymore, because it was brought shaloi lishma. And yet, the carbon itself is a carbon. So it's a little bit of more of a chiddush in our case. But Taisa says, but still, the Gemara compares it that it's similar. Similar concept where we see that there is something that's diminished in what this carbon is for the person, because there's no kapara for the woman that's not alive anymore, but yet the carbon itself is brought. So we could compare and say in our case as well that for the one, the bailim bringing the carbon, there is no point for him, there's no chayva that's being fulfilled at all, but yet the carbon itself is kosher. You can continue bringing this. That's the source that Rabbi Elazar brought for this. But it's a level. It's true. There's a kapara of the chatos, and then the oila is called a ritzui, meaning it is meratze. It's something also. Correct.
It's meratze for that person.
Correct. Amalei. So Reish Lakish said, "Ma'idin alacha ba'oila the asya la'achamisa." Yeah, I agree to you regarding a carbon oila that's brought after a person passes away. And you see this here by the Isha, this concept. But Asham, how about the carbon Asham? The halacha of our Mishnah is not only regarding a carbon oila, that for the bailim it won't be a kapara or it won't be mamal any for this chiyuv, but the carbon will be a good carbon. You find this is the halacha of our Mishnah is also for the Asham. So the loy asya by the carbon Asham, the halacha is that it's not brought. You can't bring the carbon asham if the owner died. Rashi over here brings, the Gemara learns out this halacha regarding the asham, that if the owner died, so then the carbon asham has to be left to graze, and then it gets a mum, and then you bring from the money of it for a carbon oil, but the asham itself cannot be brought after the owner passed away. So by the asham, you don't have this example. So minallah, from where do I know this concept for the asham, that even if it's now shaloi lishma and it's not going to be for the chayva of the person, but still the carbon itself I could bring? Amalei. So Rabbi Elazar answered him, Harei machlekascha b'tzidai. There's an argument about this over there, right in the Mishnah itself, because the Mishnah before the beginning of the Perek brought that this takana opinion that says that by asham it cannot be brought anymore. It becomes totally possible. Rabbi Elazar afa asham, that the asham is just like the chatas and the pesach. Just like by chatas and pesach, the shaloi lishma passes the whole carbon, by asham as well. So according to the question that Reish Lakish asked, we now understand what's the reasoning for Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. By the carbon oila, we find such an example, that it's brought achar misa. But by asham, we don't find this concept, so therefore, Rabbi Eliezer says that by asham, it'll be totally possible. So Amar Reish Lakish responds to Rabbi Elazar that answered him this, this is the individual that it said about him that he's a great person. Kamina no Mishnah Shlema. I'm bringing him a Mishnah that is the Stam Mishnah, which means the Tanakama, that says that even by an asham you could continue bringing the carbon itself. It's kosher, and it's only for the bailam that it's not going to work for his chayva. Va'at amritli Rabbi Eliezer, and you're answering me that this is the explanation of Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. I understand that this is what Rabbi Eliezer holds. I'm asking you, how do we understand the Stam Mishnah, the Tanakama, that disagrees with this? So Ella Omer Reish Lakish answered and said, and here Reish Lakish brought the drasha that the Gemara itself brought a few times before. Eftachano pischel and afshoy. I will open up this concept and I'll explain it for myself. That from where do we see a source for this? That even after the carbon itself is possible, but the bailam could still. Even though for the bailam it's not going to work for him, for the chayva that he has, but the carbon itself could still be brought. The source is the pasuk where it says, Moitzves vasecha v'gaimis. So the whole pasuk there it says, Moitzves vasecha tishmar vasisa kasher nadarta. The pasuk is saying that you're bringing this for a neder. And then the pasuk goes on to say that it's a nedava. That it's a nedava. Now neder and nedava are not the same thing. Neder is when a person says harei alai. Nedava is when a person says harei zu. So what does this mean? Hi nedava. The pasuk says that it's a nedava, nederhu, but it just said that it's a neder. The Gemara concludes kedeleil, as we darshaned before, that this is talking about a neder that turns into a nedava. When does a neder turn into a nedava? If it was brought shalei lishma, so now you are not fulfilling your vow anymore. But now the carbon itself is not possible, and you can continue bringing it just as a nedava. That's what you see in the lashon of the pasuk, that there is such a concept. Okay, this is the conclusion of the discussion of Reish Lakish. The Gemara is going to come back to it to discuss some more details about this discussion, but it brings other Amirayim that was sitting and had a similar discussion as well. So now Yosef Rab Zeire, Rab Yitzchak Bar Abba, and Yosef Abaye Gabayu, and Abaye was also sitting together with them. Yosef, they were sitting and they said, Kashile le Reish Lakish. They brought up this question that Reish Lakish had, that why is a carbon brought after you had a kavan of shalei lishma if it's not meratze, if it doesn't do anything for the owner anymore. So the Reish Lakish had this question regarding Asham, specifically regarding the carbon Asham. Why? Because since by Asham we don't see this example that it's brought after the owner passes away. And therefore, what is the source that he brought for this? As we just explained, that pasuk. Okay, but now the Gemara asks, how could you bring a source from that pasuk to answer for the carbon asham? If his whole question was specifically regarding the carbon asham, so then this pasuk mitzvah sesecha is not going to be a good source. Why? Because I can tell you, what is this pasuk mitzvah sesecha talking about? Haba beneder ubenedava, only a kind of carbon that could be brought either as a donation, as a neder, or as an nedava. So that laisi v'loy leratzi. That's a kind of carbon that I could apply this pasuk and say that it can be brought, and the carbon itself is kosher, even if for the owner itself there's no appeasement, it doesn't do anything for him. Now that's regarding a oila, a shlamim. These are karbanas that can be brought as a neder or a nedava. However, asham, a carbon asham is not a kind of carbon that you could ever bring as a neder or a nedava. A carbon asham is brought, there's the asham tolui, but there's the asham vada that's brought for me'ile, person that misappropriated hektish, or a person that swore falsely, or so that's not kind of thing that you can bring at all as a neder or a nedava. If so, le'laisi klal, this carbon asham, after you had the kavan of shalei lishma, the question still remains that it should pass all the whole carbon. We don't see that it's brought achar miseh when it's not doing a kapara for the owner, and we can't learn it from this pasuk of Maitzah Sesecha, which doesn't apply to the asham either. So Amalu Abaya that was sitting with them, answered them and said that there's something missing in what Rish Lakish answered here. Rish Lakish mehacha pasach. Really, Rish Lakish, he said he's going to open up and explain this. He explained it from the following pasuk. He first said this, that v'shachat oisa lechatos, by the carbon chatos, which is one of those karbanas that is the exception, that when you have the kavanah shalei lishma, it actually passes the whole chatos. So it says the term oisa. Only the chatos has this halacha that it must be lishma, and otherwise it passes it. Oisa lishma ksheira, only the chatos. If it's lishma, then it'll be kosher, and shalei lishma psula, and if it's shalei lishma, it'll be passer. But hashar kachim, all other karbanas shalei lishma, even if it's brought shalei lishma ksheira, it's still going to be kosher. And therefore, the asham is also part of this miyut, that it's part of the other karbanas that are going to be kosher. That was the real drasha that he brought. But now, after that, Rish Lakish continued and said, because now you would think, if so, yachol yiratza. If you're telling me that we're excluding it from the chatas, where shalei lishma passes it completely, so I would think that maybe we go to the other extreme. So the other karbanas, including the asham, should not only be kosher in itself, but it should also work for the appeasing, which is what the owner needs for his obligation. And then he brought the pasuk Talmud Leima Maitzis Vasecha. He brought this pasuk of Maitzis Vasecha to teach that it works for the carbon itself as an adava, but for the person itself, it's not going to do for the chiyuv that he needs for his neder. So he only brought this pasuk of Maitzis Vasecha after he already had the source from before, from V'shachat Eisa Lechatos, which includes an exclusion for the carbon asham as well. Okay, but the Gemara asks now, even on this as well. Even if you're going to say that he only brought the pasuk of Maitzis Vasecha as a second point, but what did he bring it for? He brought it to explain that I shouldn't say that the carbon asham should be totally kosher when it's shalei lishma, and it should work for the carbon itself, and it should work for the person himself. But now the question is, still, how can you learn out from the pasuk Maitzis Vasecha? The Eimeh, I would still say, as a question that was asked before, Habab and Neder and Nedava, only regarding a carbon that could be brought either as a Neder or Nedava. So then I say that the pasuk is teaching Laisi v'loy leratzi, that the carbon remains kosher even though it's not going to do anything for the owner himself. However, Asham, regarding the Asham, the question still remains, since I see the exclusion from the Chatas, maybe I would say Oisa lechatas, only by Chatas Shalei Lishma is going to passel, but by the Asham, since it doesn't passel, maybe the carbon should be totally kosher, even for the owner himself. I can't use this pasuk Maitzis Vasecha. It doesn't apply to the Asham. So that question still remains. So on this, Abaye explained that Rish Lakish didn't explain this, but Abaye says that you can't say. Asham de miratzi loy matzah samrit. You can't say that the exclusion, the way it relates to the Asham, is different than the other karbanas. By the other karbanas, we're going to say that the carbon is kosher, but for the person it doesn't work. But by the Asham, it's going to be totally kosher. You can't say that. Why? Because why can't you say this? Because kavachaymer me'ayla. There's a kavachaymer from the oyla to say that it won't work for the ritzui of the owner. Because uma oyla she'ena mechaperes. The carbon oila is not here for a regular kind of a kapara like it is for a chatas and a osham, which is for an aveda. So this carbon oila, which is not there for a kapara, after you had the kavan of shaloi lishma, it's not going to do any ritzui at all. The ritzui means for any effect that you need in the carbon oila for the person, it's not going to be meratza at all. Osham shemechaper, a osham which has this chumre, a osham which is a bigger kayach that it causes kapara for a person, for a real aveda. Like I mentioned the examples before. So ein din she'ein meratza. Most definitely, once there was a kavanah shaloi lishma, it shouldn't have the ability to be meratza for the person. So it's not mistaver to say that we're going to single out Osham and say that dafka the Osham is going to be totally kosher and it's still going to be meratza for the person even after there was a kavanah shalei lishma. But the Gemara says this kavachaymer that we just said from the carbon oila is not necessarily true. I can tell you malo oila, you know why, by oila with the kavanah of shalei lishma. It's not going to be meratza for the person himself. There's a certain stringency that you find by oila actually that's stronger that you don't see by Osham. Sheken kolo. Carbon oila is totally burnt in the mizbeach, not by an osham. So maybe that's why over there is this chumre that it won't work for the bailim. Maybe by the osham, though, I should say that here I exclude it from the chatas to say that it'll be totally kosher. So I can't learn out from the oila. Says the Gemara, okay, so shpat shlamim yichichu. There's another carbon that the same halacha applies, that it'll still be kosher for the bailim. The carbon is going to be kosher, but for the bailim it won't work, and that's also a carbon shlamim. And that is also learned out from the pasuk Moitzis Vasecha. So I could learn out the Osham from the Shlamim. But now the Gemara says you can't learn out from Shlamim. Why not? Mal Shlamim, there's a certain stringency by Shlamim. Shekain tu'unin, nisachin, utnufas chazav v'shaik. The Shlamim has a few details that you find after by the Shlamim, that it needs the wine, and it's lifted up, the chazah and the shaik, when you bring this carbon. So since there's certain chumres by the shlamim, you can't learn out the osham from the shlamim either. Oila techiach. So I go back to the carbon oila that does not have the chumra of the shlamim. The chazar adin, and now the limud goes back between the oila and the shlamim, and every time you have a pircha from one, and you want to say, oh, this is the cause of the din, that it won't be meratza the bailam, the unique chumra that oila has, I prove to you from shlamim that that's not the reason, because shlamim does not have that chumra. And when you point out the chumra of shlamim, I take you back to oila to say that the chumra of shlamim is also not the cause of the din. So this does not have the chumra of the other, and the other does not have the chumra of this. So we look at the common denominator, shehein kachim, oila and shlamim are kachim, all in one category of kachim that is not a chatas, and v'shachtan shalei lishman, and if you shech them shalei lishma, what happens? Kshein, the carbon itself remains kosher, but ve'ei meratzen, but it does not do its effect for the owner. So afani yavi asham, I compare the asham and learn from these two. Shuhu kaidesh, it's also another carbon. V'shachtan shalei lishma, when you shech the shalei lishma kosher, the carbon itself will remain kosher ve'ei meratzen, but it will not have its effect for the owner. That's the limud. Atzad, hashavet, the common denominator from both the oila and the shlamim. But the Gemara asks on this limud as well, how can you compare it to oila and shlamim? Malatzad hashavet sheben. There's something about these two, oila and shlamim, that are different than the asham. They have a unique chumre. Sheken yeshnoi b'tzibur. These are two kinds of karbanis that can be brought b'tzibur. The oila all the time, the carbon oila is tamid every day, and all is brought b'tzibur. And the Rashi says the shlamim as well is brought on shvuas, the kivsei atzeres that's brought together with the breads is a carbon that's brought b'tzibur. So that's a unique chumrah that you find by oila and shlamim that you do not have by the asham, that can only be brought for a private aveda. So how can we learn out from them? And says the Gemara, there's a third carbon. Taida yechiach. If so, a carbon taida, that's one of the other kachim that's included in this din, that it's going to be kosher and not be meratza for the bailam. That will prove that we can learn from there that the same should apply for the asham. But the Gemara says you can't learn from the taida alone. Malat taida shekain tuhuna lechem. Taida has a unique stringency that it's not just a carbon that's brought, animal, but it has to have the breads that are brought with it. There's 40 breads that are brought with it. So we go back to oila and shlamim. Oila and shlamim yechichu. Oila and shlamim that don't have breads will prove that the lechem is not the cause for this din. And now the limit goes back between taida And Oila and Shlamim, Loidi Zekri Zev, Loidi Zekri Zev, the Chumrah of one is not the Chumrah of the other, so that proves that that specific Chumrah is not the cause of the din. So we go to the common denominator, that it's Kachim, V'shachtan Shalei Lishma, and if it's shechted Shalei Lishma, then it's kosher. The carbon itself is kosher. Ve'eina meratze, it doesn't work for the owner. Afani Avi Asham, the same applies to the Asham. Shehu Kaidesh, V'shachtan Shalei Lishma, kosher. Ve'eina meratze. When you shech the Shalei Lishma, it will be kosher and will not be meratze for the owner. So I could learn out from these three together: Oila, Shlamim, and Taida. But the Gemara asks, you actually cannot learn out from these three together. Why not? There's something about these three: Oila, Shlamim, and Taida. Shehein, Ba'am, Beneder, Benadav. These are kinds of karbanis that a person could make a vow or a nadav. He could donate it on his own. These are not karbanis that have to be brought after when a person has an obligation. So it's different. Maybe this is the reason why the halacha applies in this case, because they are unique, that they're born b'neder u'b'nedava. This is a question in here in the Shittim Mekabetzes. It says that this pircha the Gemara says here right now, the Gemara could have asked this pircha all the way in the beginning. But he says that be'emes, this kind of a pircha is a weak pircha, because the fact that it could come b'neder u'b'nedava doesn't necessarily clearly show a concept of a chumrah. Before the Gemara is bringing a chumrah, which means a specific din that I see that oila is burnt completely on the mizbeach. There's more dinim that you have to do, nesachim, oila, or lechem. Those are specific chumras. The fact that it could be brought b'neder or b'nedava, the Gemara doesn't consider that necessarily to be such a good pircha. Therefore, it waits to bring this pircha only in the end. But the Gemara accepts this pircha, and the Gemara says, Elo Omar Rove. So Rava answers that the reason why we compare the Asham to these karbanis is not because of this tzad hashava. It's hekish in the pasuk. Zayis hatayra v'gayim. The Gemara already brought this hekish earlier on the Dav Daled. And the pasuk says Zayis hatayra. It says Oila l'mincha l'chatas l'asham l'milum l'zavach hashlamim. It's comparing all these karbanis. Hikisha akasav l'shlamim. So in this pasuk, the Torah is comparing the Asham to the shlamim. Ma shlamim shen kachim. So shlamim is one of the karbanis. V'shachtan shlei l'shma. When it's shachtan shlei l'shma, kshedim, the carbon is kosher. Ve'ei meratzin, but it doesn't work for the owner. That's the halacha by the shlamim that we learned out from the pasuk before of that the mitzvah v'secha tishmar. So afani yavi asham. So I compare to the asham and say shu kaidesh chulu. It's also a carbon kaidesh, and if it's shlei l'shma, it'll be kosher, but it won't be meratzah for the bailam. So here, since it's a hekesh, so Rashi says the rule is ein meshivan ala hekesh. By hekesh, you can't start asking questions that it's not compared. The hekesh means you have to compare it. Now the Gemara asks though on this hekesh as well, my chaz is the akshas l'shlamim. Why are you comparing it to the shlamim that's mentioned in this pasuk, akish l'chatas? In the very same pasuk, it actually mentions right there. It says chatas and asham together as well. Maybe compare it to the chatas to say that it's going to be completely possible. So the Gemara says no, but that's not an option because hamiyat rachmana oisa. That we already brought before. The Torah says clearly v'shachat oisa lechatos that it's only by the chatos that it's going to be totally possible and not by any other karbanis. So therefore, the asham, we have two options. We could either say that the asham would be totally kosher, not like any other kachim, or we could say that we compare it to shlamim, to other karbanis, that it's going to be kosher, but not meratzah l'bailam. So that's the hekesh that we learn out, that this applies by the carbon asham as well. Okay, now Gemara here brings a simin heinun shin, beis shin reish. This is a simin actually for the names of the Amiroim that are going to discuss this subject here further. Yosef, Rav Huna, Rav Nachman. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman was sitting together with Yosef, Rav Sheshes Gabayo. And Rav Sheshes was sitting together with them, Yosvi v'Ka'amri, and they were sitting and they were discussing, going back now to what we learned in the beginning, Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish was discussing this subject, and they said as follows, Kash, Shalele Reish Lakish Asham. What was Reish Lakish's question regarding the carbon Asham specifically? How could you say by an Asham that the carbon is kosher, but it doesn't work to be meratzeh for the Bailam? And what was this question? I don't find by the Asham that it's brought after the owner dies. We see the Gemara brought there by the Eiledes, that after she dies, the carbon is still brought. So I see the carbon itself is kosher, even though it's not used for the owner anymore, the woman died. But by Asham, I don't see that. So Reish Lakish was wondering, where's the source by a carbon Asham for this concept? That was his question. So now they asked the question, Rabbi Lazar that was sitting with Reish Lakish, Rabbi Lazar should have answered him, that Asham Nami, even regarding the carbon Asham as well, it is a carbon that's brought even after the owner dies. Now, what does this mean? So, as we'll see from the continuation of the Gemara, what it means to say is, it's not the carbon asham itself is not actually brought after Misa. After Misa, that carbon asham has to be left to graze, it gets a mom, and then you redeem it, and the money is then used to be brought as a carbon oila on the Mizbeach. This is what's called actually Kayetz HaMizbeach, when the Mizbeach doesn't have carbonis, so then you bring from this the carbon on the Mizbeach. But here, they were arguing and saying, you do see this concept that you're taking from the asham and then using it to bring after the owner passed away, even if it's not mamish this carbon itself, but nevertheless you see that it's going to be used eventually for a carbon, and the carbon itself is kosher, even though it's not effective at all for the bailim himself that passed away. So even by the asham we see this concept. This is also a discussion in Mefarshim. This is even more removed than the main point we're trying to prove here, that the carbon should be kosher, and it's not going to be meratzah for the person himself at all. We're bringing here this example of the asham that you're going to take from the asham afterwards and buy from it another carbon, but the Gemara says that they're arguing that even this has in it the kernel of the same concept. I don't know exactly how to explain why that is, but they held that this is the same concept. So Rav Sheshe says no, it's actually not the same concept. Asham lamai karev, after the person dies, and you say now that the asham could still be brought as a carbon. How? What does it mean? It's still going to be brought as a carbon. L'maisrei. What that means is that there's the money that's left from it. Right? So in other words, the animal itself is left to graze, and then it gets a mum, and then you take that money and you bring another carbon. But that's not the asham itself. If that's what you're referring to, he says that doesn't apply here, and actually he says even more. Chatas nami mikrav karva maisra chatas. Mikrav karva. Mikrav karva maisra chatas it is, yeah. All right, how did I have over there? Mikrav karva. Mikrav karva maisara, that is. Okay, very good. So, but what does this mean? So Rashi explains that you find such a concept by the chatas as well. Even though we had before, Rashi mentioned that by carbon chatas there's a if the owner dies, the carbon chatas has to be left to die. You can't do anything with it. You can't then take the money of it. But there is an example though. Let's say a person, when he had to bring a carbon chatas, he was makdish 2 animals for his carbon chatas. Wanted to have a security. So he brought one as a chatas. The other one though, he didn't bring. Right? He already had his full kapara. And then later the person passes away. That carbon that he was l'chatchila makdish, a second carbon for a chatas, that's not in this halacha of chatas shemesu balel. That second chatas is similar to the asham, that it's left to graze, and when it gets a mum, you bring from the money, a carbon oila. So you see that this concept applies by a chatas as well. So the chatas, afagav the karva maisara, even though I do see that this concept applies, that then in this case the money of it will be used for a carbon even after the owner died. But mi'et rachmanahu. But the Torah says that it doesn't matter, that it has to be brought. The lashon of the pasuk, it says hu v'samach yad harisha so v'shachat chatas hu. What does chatas hu means? That this is a chatas, meaning that you must bring it l'shma, and if you don't bring it l'shma, then it's going to be totally puzzle. Right? So we see that we even though we find such an example by the chatas that the carbon chatas itself could be brought eventually for some kind of a carbon coming from this chatas. So you have a source from there to say that even though it doesn't work for the owner, but the carbon itself is still kosher, but there's a pasuk that says that by the chatas it doesn't work. So if so, asham nami, I should say by the asham as well, ksiv behu. So the Gemara asks us, I should apply the same thing regarding the carbon asham. Over there, there's also a pasuk that says who. So you can't bring a raya from this that you find by the carbon asham, that it could be brought achar misa when it was left to graze, and then you use the money for this. But by the carbon chatas, that's true, but still there's a miyat of who that says that it has to be brought for the chatas. So if so, the same thing it says by the asham. The lashon of the pasuk by asham, it also says who. The pasuk there says vehikter aisam akayin hamizbecha ishel Hashem asham who. So it should have to be brought lishma, and if not, it should be totally puzzle. Because therefore, this is a question. This is a question that Rish Lakish was discussing the asham. Now the Gemara is adding that the whole discussion here about the asham is actually a very valid question, seemingly because it says the word who, just like by the chatas, that should require that it should be lishma. But the Gemara answers no. This who is not a question. Why not? Because ahu la'acha haktares emurim hu de ksiv. That word who, when it says it by the asham, where does it say it? It says it after it speaks v'hikter. After it speaks about bringing the fat or the pieces, that is, of the behemoth itself to burn on the mizbeach. If it says the word hu regarding the haktara, it can't be referring to this, that it must be brought l'shma, otherwise it would passel the carbon, because the whole halacha of l'shma, to passel the carbon, as we learned before, only applies to the previous avedis, which is the main aved of the carbon, the shchita, the halacha, the kabbalah, the halacha, and the zrika. After the zrika, there's no halacha of l'shma anymore. Whether you makta the carbon on the mizbeach or not, it's not ma'akad the kapara. So therefore, the word hu cannot be referring to this. It has to be referring to something else. Ketitanya, as it says this in a braisa, that aval asham loinema by hu ela la'achak taris imunim. By the asham, where does it say that word hu? It only says it in the Torah, in the pasuk where it begins v'hikter, after he brought all the pieces on the mizbeach. So, therefore, it cannot be applying to this din of l'shma, because v'hu atzmai im la yiktire imunim kasher. Regarding the haktar of the emurim, even if you don't bring bechlal, the pieces on the mizbeach, the carbon is still kosher, and it already had its effect till the zrika. So therefore, there's no question from the hu regarding the asham. So now the Gemara explains, if that's the case, ve'elohu lamali. So that hu that it says by asham, if it's not coming to teach the halacha of the shema, what do we learn from this hu? The Gemara answers, look at the Rav Huna Amarav. Here we learn another halacha that Rav Huna said in the name of Rav. Rav Huna Amarav. Asham shenitik l'raya. This asham that we spoke about before, the owner died, and it's supposed to be left to graze. So now the Gemara here says it has to be nitik l'raya. Nitik l'raya means that it was already evaluated by the Bezdin what the situation is, and they set it out to go and be placed in with the graze. So it already was separated for this purpose. And then what happened, after this happened, he didn't wait until it gets a mum and then go buy an oil from the leftover money. Rather, the kohen went, v'shach stam. He took this asham itself that was already separated for this purpose, and he went and shechted it as a stam carbon. Kosher, it's going to be kosher. Now, what's the limud of the hu? Nitek in. Only once it was already evaluated by the Bezdin and it was placed out to graze, then I say because it was already separated from its status of an asham, so now if it's brought stam, it'll be kosher. However, loy nitik, loy, but if it was not separated yet for this purpose and it still retains the status of an asham, if you're going to bring it stam, it's not going to be kosher because it says in the Torah hu that has to be brought for the asham at that point. My time omakra hu bav yasayeh, it still remains in the status of an asham. That's what you learn from this word hu. Other Amiroim that sat and discussed this subject, Yasser of Nachman, Rav Sheshes, Yasser of Adabar Masna Gabayu. So that Rav Nachman and Rav Sheshes were sitting together, and Rav Adabar Masna was with them. And V'Yasvi v'Ka'amri, and they sat and they were saying that the Ka'amar Rabbi Elazar, going back to the point that Rabbi Elazar said, Matzinu b'ba'in la'acham misa shehen ksherin ve'ein meratzen. We find the example, he was bringing you, where do you see this concept where the carbon itself is kosher, but it doesn't work anymore for the owner? So the example is, he brought from the Yeledes, a woman that gives birth, and she did not bring her oila yet, so the oila is brought after she passes away, which is kosher, but doesn't work for her anymore. That was the source. That was Rabbi Eliezer. Now, they asked a question on this example. Reish Lakish should have responded to him and asked, how do you know that this is true? Maybe the carbon oil of this Yeledes that's brought after she passes away is brought as a carbon, and maybe it also causes a ritzoy, an appeasement, that it has an effect also for the owner bringing it. At this point, who's the owner bringing it? The Yarshim, her children that are bringing this carbon. Maybe for them, there is a ritzoy that works here. Amalan of Adabar Masna, so Adabar Masna answers, you can't say this. Yeledes, the woman that gave birth, if she gave birth, but now miyoldu, that her children give birth. So for her, there's a point for this carbon to be meratza. But once she dies, her children are just bringing the carbon itself, but for them there is nothing that this carbon is coming to accomplish. So therefore this is the source that Rabbi Elazar brought. Now I have a maskeflor of Asi, or Rav Ashi asked on this, Oman leimelon, but how do you know? Maybe for the children, the carbon could have an effect for them. Man leimelon, who would tell us the ikekama asay gaba? Let's say even by the woman herself that gave birth. If she was over an other mitzvah asay, who would tell us that loy miskapra, that it would not, that this carbon oil she brings for the birth, that it would not be a kapara also for other mitzvah asay? Rashi here brings b'chlal. This is the halacha of an oila. Oila, it says in the pasuk, v'nirtzaloi, it is a ritzui for something. It's not for like for a chatos, for what a shaygin chatos, for something that you chayav kares, or for other avedis where there's misa or malchus or other punishments. So what is it mechaper for? V'nirtzaloi, it's mechaper for an asa. Right, so if it's mechaper for an esser by a woman that gave birth, it's mechaper also for any other esser that she is over on. So if so, v'kivin d'chi'ike kama segaba mechapra, if it's going to be mechaper for different essers that apply by her, so yasher nami mechapri. It should be mechaper for the children as well. So therefore, there's no source from here to say that this carbon, this is an example of a carbon, that the carbon itself is kosher, but it's not meratza for the owner anymore, because maybe it is. The Yarshim now, for them, it would be mechaper if they need a kapara for any mitzvah saseh. So this is the question they asked on Rabbi Lazar's answer to Reish Lakish. Okay, the Gemara is going to continue discussing this. It's in the middle of an inyan here, but it goes all the way down to the Amid. We'll continue with Hashem tomorrow.